Makasaysayang araw po sa ating lahat. Maya aldo kekongan, maayong aldaw sa inyo tanan. Welcome to Quincentennial Lecture Series number 7. Because of the pandemic, ilan lang po ang ating mga events for this, official events for this quincentennial. And one of them is this special online lecture, mga kaibigan. So, this online lecture, the Quincentennial Lecture Series number 7, Lapulapu and Mactan, Heritage of the Filipino by National Artist Resil Mojares, is being brought to you by the National Quincentennial Committee, Presidential Communications of Philippine Information Agency, Department of Foreign Affairs, Department of Education, National Commission for Culture and the Arts, the City Government of Cebu, Cebu City Historical and Cultural Affairs Office, and the Cebu Studies Center. We will now proceed to introduce our speaker. We're so honored because the Cebu province is the ground zero of the National Quincentennial commemorations. Dito po nangyari ang Battle of Mactan, dito po nangyari ang in the Philippines. Kaya po, nais ko pong ipakilala sa inyo, I would like to introduce to you bansang Pilipinas. When we talk about Cebu and the history of Cebu, isa po ang naiisip, isang tao ang naiisip ng marami. And that is our special lecture for today. So our lecturer po is National Artist of the Philippines. And siya po ay sumulat ng napakaraming mga aklat ukol sa ating literatura, ukol sa ating sa Cebu. Casa Gordo is one of them. War with the Americans, at marami pa hong iba. He recently wrote an introduction, a very useful introduction to the historical Lapu-Lapu and all the myths that we associated to him. In an introduction that he wrote to a novel by a Cebuano author, Gulyas, Lapu-Lapu, the Conqueror of Magellan. I would like to, and I'm so honored to present to you, to tell us about Lapulapu and Mactan, Heritage of the Filipino, ladies and gentlemen, National Artist Resil Mojares. Sir?
20 or 30 native boats. Although as an aside, I should say that when you come across in accounts of this kind, figures like 3,000 men, I mean, that should be taken figuratively rather than literally. It's a way of saying a large number of men. No? Humabon and his men had joined the channel crossing but stayed at sea because Magellan wanted them to stay behind and witness what was supposed to be a demonstration of the foreigners' martial might. And so the battle began. The Mactanons, estimated to number 1,500, equipped with shields, bladed weapons, arrows, spears, and lances, against the Spaniards with their helmets and corselets, armed with muskets, crossbows, and swords. Organized in a three-flanked battle formation, the Mactanons fought a quick skirmishing style of warfare, of constant movement, rushing in and out until they completely swamped Magellan's men. Magellan had ordered his men to withdraw as he stayed behind when he was hit by a poisoned arrow in his right leg. There's one or two questions we need to revisit about the battle that took place in 1521. and how was the battle fought? As a type of warfare, the Battle of Mactan was unusual. A large-scale, frontal, pitched battle was exceptional in pre-Hispanic Visayan society. And this can generally be said as well of Malay societies in insular Southeast Asia. In early Visayan society, the typical form of warfare was raiding, or in the local language, pangayaw, usually from the sea, carried out for slaves and booty, or to exact revenge, weaken a rival, attract allies, and expand one's sphere of influence. It was not meant to acquire or occupy territory, since land was abundant and population densities low, and was usually sudden and quick. Long sieges were rare. The typical response of settlements raided by a superior force was flight rather than confrontation. Houses of light materials can easily be rebuilt after the raiders withdraw. Precious possessions are portable, and the loss of lives was what must be avoided, since people, rather than territory, are a chief's most valuable resource. Hence, as the scholar Jose Angeles describes, indigenous warfare was risk-averse, aggregative, display-oriented, skirmish style, one that generally avoided direct confrontation or combat, placed the premium on diplomacy, intimidating displays of force, skirmishes, deception, and rational assessments of risks, such as going into battle only if groups judge themselves to be superior or equal in strength. Thus, the Mactanons quickly abandoned the Mactan village called Bulaya in the raid that the Spaniards conducted before April 27. Likewise, in 1565, the Cebuanos, after a token resistance, did not defend the Cebu port settlement when Legazpi invaded Cebu, choosing instead to abandon it, withdraw to the interior, and from there engage in ambush, harassment, and the denial of food supplies to the Spanish camp. As a large set-piece battle, a type of warfare associated with Europeans, the Battle of Mactan was not a typical indigenous battle. So the question that can be raised is, why then did Lapulapu go to war the way he did? There are several explanations that can be made. To begin with, the standard response of flight, meaning just fleeing, abandoning the village, was not available. For Mactan, a flat island just 70 square kilometers, there was no hinterland to withdraw to, and flight by sea had its problems since the Magellan-Humabon alliance controlled the waters. More important, this was not one of the raids with which Visayans were familiar, since it was clear that the Spaniards were not there simply for slaves and booty and then leave. They seemed intent to stay and impose their authority over the region. A contributory factor, one not widely recognized, is that Mactan was attacked twice before April 27. The first was the raid on the settlement of Bulaya, which is Buaya, which is a barrio just outside Lapu-Lapu City today. A raid that Pigafetta mentions. carried out sometime in the third week of April because the people refused to obey Magellan and his surrogate, Humabon. A second raid was apparently, and this is something that has not been mentioned in many sources, but there was a second raid that apparently took place not long after, mentioned by the Italian chronicler Peter Martyr, who interviewed some of the expedition survivors when they returned, after they returned to Spain. Martyr writes that Magellan led his men to Matam, which is what he called the place, Matam. A reference that I think is, the reference I think is to the town of Opon, which is now Lapu-Lapu City, to demand that Lapu-Lapu submit to the Spanish king and Humabon. Lapu-Lapu is said to have replied that he was willing to obey the king of Spain, but not Humabon. Thereupon, Magellan ordered a fortress composed of about 50 houses to be sacked and burned. In both Bulaya and Matam, the Mactanons responded to the raids in the traditional way. They withdrew from their settlement without or after some initial resistance. After being raided twice, Lapu-Lapu must have decided it was time to stand their ground. There was, however, perhaps the most important reason that Lapu-Lapu and his men did not flee their island. Mactan was not an island to be easily abandoned, since the strategic location in relation to local and international shipping made it a prized location. Temporarily abandoning it, as they could have done, was no longer an option because of the nature of the Spanish intrusion and the local political context of which I shall later on speak about. First, the Spaniards did not come as raiders, but as an occupying force, intent on rearranging the existing political order and imposing their sovereignty, unilaterally declaring Humabon as the king that all the chiefs in Cebu and the region should obey. While Magellan initially said that the expedition was on its way to the Moluccas and was in Cebu only to procure provisions, his actions in the days that followed, like baptizing the locals, appointing Humabon as his surrogate, saying that the Spaniards would return with a larger force, indicated he had long-term plans. Second, one must understand how radically disruptive the Spanish intrusion was in terms of local politics. Visayan polity consisted of what anthropologists call chiefdoms, alliance networks of chiefs bound by loose ties of personal allegiance to a senior among them. A chief's authority derived from lineage, number of subjects, physical prowess, and wealth that mainly consisted of disposable goods for patronage and prestige, acquired through control of ports and shipping lanes, tariffs and anchorage fees, tributes and labor services, and raiding and piracy. The anthropologist Laura Lee Juncker identifies the Cebu port as the seat of what she calls a paramount chiefdom based on maritime trade. A paramount chiefdom has a three-level hierarchy in contrast with simple and complex chiefdoms, which has one or two levels respectively, in which the paramount chief exercises authority or influence over chiefs who in turn have influence on lesser chiefs under them. As ruler of the port of Cebu, Humabon was a paramount chief, with direct influence over an estimated population of at least 2,000 people in the port settlement, and an outlying network of lesser chiefs as allies with their own followers. So this is kind of the nature of the polity of Cebu and of the Visayas in general in pre-colonial times. Typically, chiefdoms were weakly centralized, characterized by shifting alliance networks and endemic inter-polity competition. The Visayan political landscape was fragmented, multi-centered, and unstable. And in the 15th and 16th centuries, inter-polity warfare had intensified because of competition over the rewards of an expanding trade with China and other countries. Primary sources indicate that at the time of Magellan's arrival, there was an ongoing feud between Humabon and Lapulapu over control of the Mactan Channel. Such control was vital since it was the lifeblood of Lapulapu's chieftainship. The only resource Mactan had was its strategic location along a busy shipping lane, a vantage point from which it can interdict, divert, exact levies, and raid incoming or passing vessels. This was the base of Lapulapu's power. The testimonies of expedition members, so this is what you would call primary or eyewitness accounts. The expedition members who kind of returned to Spain. Sebastian Elcano, Martin de Ayamonte, Francisco Albo, Fernando de Bustamante, Fernando Oliveira, and the informants of chronicler Maximilianos Transilvanos all point to the Lapu-Lapu-Humabon feud as the key factor behind the Battle of Mactan. These testimonies say or indicate that Lapu-Lapu was a military leader superior to the other chiefs, and perhaps even Humabon himself. At the time, the Magellan expedition came to Cebu, and that Lapu-Lapu was willing to obey the Spanish king, but not Humabon. Sebastian Elcano, who of course is now famous because he was the one who led the expedition that on its final leg of its return to Spain. Elcano was reported to have said that Lapu-Lapu was highly regarded in the arts of war and was more powerful than all his neighbors, and that he rejected demands that he recognized Humabon as his king, saying that he was unwilling to come and do reverence to one, meaning Humabon, whom he had been commanding for so long a time. Expedition pilot Francisco Albo said that the people of Mactan wanted to obey the King of Spain, but refused Magellan's demand that they had to kiss the hand of the King of Cebu. The chronicler Gaspar Correa wrote that Humabon and his people were at war with their neighbors, who were more powerful than themselves. And it was for this reason that Humabon became Christian with all his people in order that Magellan might assist him against his enemies. All this may be a Spanish post-debacle gloss on the events, but the weight of independent testimonies do give credence to the crucial importance of local politics in these events. For Lapu-Lapu, diplomacy was no longer an option since Magellan had already chosen Humabon as the Christian king that all the chiefs must obey. In this respect, one wonders whether Lapu-Lapu would have resisted if Magellan had chosen him as ally instead of Humabon. Forging alliances, after all, was the stuff of indigenous politics. As Laura Juncker notes, it was common that local datus attempted to manipulate the relations with the Spaniards to wage an effective military campaign against their competitors and gain political control. Given all this, Lapu-Lapu must have judged that he had no option except to resist the Spaniards or yield to Humabon and cede his claims to Cebu's trade, the basis of his chieftainship. He chose to resist. And that's how the Battle of Mactan came about. Now, how was the battle fought? Magellan's biographers see the Battle of Mactan as one that Magellan lost rather than one Lapu-Lapu won. This is understandable. Magellan is the protagonist in these accounts, and there was exceedingly little in the sources that could be said about Lapu-Lapu. And Eurocentric sources are wont to deny natives any meaningful agency. Thus, the Magellan biographer Stefan Zweig, in heightening Magellan's grandly ironic death, wrote that the great Magellan, and I quote, was felled by a ludicrous insect, a human insect named Lapu-Lapu, and referred to the Mactanons as a horde of naked islanders. Thus, in explaining the debacle in Mactan, authors ascribe the defeat to the Spaniards' lack of cohesion, their small ragtag force, and Magellan's delusions of invincibility, his overweening faith in the superiority of Spaniards over pagans. From the time he arrived in Cebu, he had boasted about being captain of the greatest king and prince on earth, and declared that our arms overthrow and destroy all our adversaries. Such bravado, however, could not hide problems in the expedition itself. There was dissension in the expedition as Magellan's officers grumbled over why they had dallied in Cebu when they should have proceeded straight away to their destination, the Moluccas, and why Magellan was baptizing natives and playing politics when this was not part of the aims of the expedition. Thus, when Magellan hastily decided they would go into battle, his officers and seasoned soldiers did not join, leaving Magellan to go into battle with, quoting a biographer, a small, motley contingent of stewards, cabin boys, and sobresalientes, meaning like kind of young gentlemen who were there for the adventure or the education, like Antonio Pigafetta himself. They were not only grossly outnumbered, they were outfought. So this was an important factor, that the dissension within the expedition itself, meaning the expedition was on the verge of a mutiny when they were in Cebu. Because the interesting thing about the Cebu episode is, I think it is the most puzzling or problematic episode in the whole 3-year journey of the Magellan expedition. Because a change came over Magellan. It started baptizing people and establishing his authority, when this was not at all what the expedition was about. Cebu was meant to be just a provisioning stop. They take in supplies and they proceed to what was in fact the object of the expedition, the Moluccas Islands. It would seem from the performative character of the Mactan battle, as Pigafetta narrates it, that Magellan was acting out of the medieval drama of chivalry, imagining himself performing great feats for his god and king and winning honor and wealth for himself and his family. Warned about being outnumbered as he went into battle, he is reported to have invoked the story of how in Yucatan in Mexico, 200 Spaniards fought and defeated 300,000 of their enemies. In this spirit, he ordered Humabon, who had brought his followers to fight with Magellan, to stay behind, to stay with his men in their boats, and just watch how Europeans defeat their enemies. Magellan was a victim of his own fantasy of himself. Yet it must be said as well that the Mactanons fought an intelligent, well-planned, and executed battle. Lapulapu had fortuitous advantages. He had time to prepare, since European battle protocols, which involved the sending of emissaries, declarations of intent, deprived Magellan of the element of surprise. It is likely that Lapulapu had prior intelligence about the coming attack, the size of the enemy's landing force, and that the Spanish ship's guns would be out of range. After all, communications easily carry across the channel. Lapulapu adapted to the conditions of battle better than Magellan did. He knew his enemy better than Magellan knew his. He chose a battle site in which the terrain was favorable to his men, the rocky shallows of a shore where mobility was a problem for men in boots and armor. Through trickery and delaying tactics, he chose the time of battle most favorable because of the changing tide, engaged in diversionary actions to divide the enemy, targeted the exposed parts of the body of the armored enemy, probably timed their pattern of attack and retreat according to the times the Spaniards reloaded their muskets and fought a battle that combined a three-flank formation with a skirmishing style of combat in which his men would retreat, evade, advance in a pattern of constant movement. The battle may have been one Magellan lost, but it was also one that Lapu-Lapu and his men clearly won. So in conclusion, what did it all mean? Little is known of the person of Lapu-Lapu in the time of the battle, and practically nothing is known about what became of him after the battle. It can be said that the victory of Mactan simply delayed by 45 years the European colonization of the Philippines. When Legazpi arrived in Cebu in 1565 to initiate the Spanish conquest and colonization of the Philippines, the Spaniards found Mactan practically depopulated. The local population apparently had fled in fear of reprisals over the killing of Magellan. For the next 3 centuries of Spanish rule, Lapu-Lapu was the villain, not the hero. That's why I like kind of the celebration of Lapu-Lapu as a hero would of course come only after the Spanish period. In Cebu, it was not until 1933 that the first monument to Lapu-Lapu was built. This is the monument in the town plaza of what is now Lapu-Lapu City. Today's memorialization of Lapu-Lapu as the first Filipino to have repelled European aggression, which is the text of the National Historical Institute marker at the Mactan Shrine, is anachronistic and presentist given the facts and the terms used. It is a heritage statement that has its uses as shorthand for commemorative purposes rather than a historical one. It may be more current and relevant to locate the battle's significance, not so much in terms of the drama of nationalism, but in that of globalization. After all, Magellan's circumnavigation of the globe is now remembered as a founding event in the history of globalization. Saying that Cebu is the Ur site of globalization the scholar Adam Lifshitz frames the large contemporary significance of Lapu-Lapu quite well. And with his words, I shall end this lecture. I quote, various Lapu-Lapus keep defending their islands against sundry Magellans, and these Magellans keep dying and resurrecting only to land once more at Mactan. The captains of globalization cannot control its consequences, its transmutations, its resistances, but their ships of state do keep arriving at Filipino docks time upon time upon time. The waves of globalization are where Lapu-Lapu made his stand. This is where his legacy survives. Daghang salamat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Resil Mojares, our national artist, for that. It gave us new perspectives. We always frame the Battle of Mactan as something about nationalism. And this was the legacy, of course, of the founders of the nation. Mariano Ponce named himself in La Solidaridad Calipulaco, which is another name for Lapu-Lapu. And then, of course, Emilio Jacinto wanted to wake up the Tagalogs, the Filipinos, in the name of the you have the blood of Lapu-Lapu. And the Declaration of Independence also have Lapu-Lapu in the declaration. So we always frame it in nationalism terms. But now you've shown us in this lecture that more than that, it's really about globalization, and it was against globalization. And I have a question though. Dr. Mojares, what do you call this? There's an information that was not always emphasized. That's not always emphasized was that you said a while ago that some of because Pigafetta is not only the primary source of the Battle of Mactan. You also have Francisco Albo, and you said Peter Martyr interviewed the survivors. And the two accounts are united in saying that Lapu-Lapu will accept the King of Spain, but not Humabon. Does that affect the stature of Lapu-Lapu as a hero? You think so, sir?
No, kind of, as I said, alliance building that was what local politics was all about.
Yeah.
I mean, building alliances, and kind of, like for instance, in the case of Humabon, what's interesting about, for instance, the baptism, is how quickly, even before he actually came face to face with Magellan, how quickly he consented to be baptized.
Yeah.
And that's because he knew that kind of this was a powerful man, and kind of he
Right.
would benefit by striking up an alliance with this man.
Yeah.
So how Humabon reacted to the presence of Magellan was kind of very typical. And
yes.
and there's no reason to kind of believe that Lapu-Lapu, if he were in the same place, would have acted
Yes.
differently, because it was very clear that the new arrivals were really powerful men.
Right.
Like the Muslim merchant who was in Cebu at the time said, these were the men who conquered India and Malacca.
Right.
You know? So like creating alliances but alliances too were kind of I mean, this kind of tactical, because
Right.
An alliance can break up the following year. So I mean, there's, for instance, I think when Humabon, for instance, decided to strike up an alliance with Magellan, it probably was he was trying to see as to what his options were.
Right.
But he could very well have broken away from the alliance, as he did. And
Eventually,
by
killing the Spanish leaders.
by carrying out the massacre of the Spaniards, meaning that his patron was dead, And now he was kind of trying to, according to the popular accounts, trying to mend relation with
Lapulapu, yes.
because of the fear that he was going to completely lose his legitimacy as a leader, and so like asserted again his power by conducting this massacre. So alliances are shifting and kind of and loose. So so this could very well have been kind of, he was biding his time to see as to, you know, what his options were, how things will develop, and so on.
It's fantastic because I was rereading Pigafetta, and you know, there's always this notion that Humabon of Cebu. You know, when I first visited Cebu and you know saw Humabon statue, I said, why does this guy have a statue here? You know, Humabon sold us to the Spaniards. He was uto-uto, you know, in Tagalog. No? But you know, in rereading Pigafetta, you see him as an astute politician, someone who hindi siya nabola, who was not fooled by Magellan. And when I see his actions, he's like the typical Filipino politician, as you have said.
I mean, Nick, I think you're familiar with this. Nick Joaquin wrote this article, which is actually a lecture he first delivered here in Cebu, about the Filipino as twins, Lapulapu and Humabon as twins. I mean, he was saying that kind of Lapulapu and Humabon represent the two strands in our history, one of accommodation and the other of resistance. That you can't just kind of exclude one and just think of the other, but you have a dialectic between kind of these two responses to the challenge of the West, or kind of, you know, adaptation, and that both are present. And so he says, when he says the Filipino as twins, that Humabon represented this kind of accommodation, adaptation, and so on, whereas Lapu-Lapu represented resistance, which is kind of a fine point. Of course, kind of the circumstances were different. Lapu-Lapu could well be the one who's accommodating, the one resisting.
Yeah, in a way, you're going to see here that our views, you showed in the lecture, that our views of history are not necessarily historical, that they are shaped by present realities. We appropriate them to our needs. And so with Lapu-Lapu, we made him a national hero because the national heroes needed someone, because you know there's a very fine article from Patricia Abinales who said, why are you looking at Lapu-Lapu as a symbol of pre-colonial culture? Why don't you look at Sharif Kabungsuan of Maguindanao? But the problem was, they needed Lapu-Lapu when they were creating the nation because they were against Spain. And this guy won against Spain. That's a very fantastic point. Now, I'm interested about, you know, your title was Lapu-Lapu and Mactan and the Legacy to Filipinos. And you're saying now that it's, you know, we're facing a lot of challenges today like COVID, and it's also due to globalization. And I also see that you have connected that we don't usually look at 1500s as globalization, but apparently it was the precursor of globalization. So now I think, you know, we're looking for questions. That most of these comments from our live video are like shout outs to you for being a great teacher. These are your fans. My mother is watching, Vilma Chua. Thank you. Get well soon to my father. I have a question. I'm interested about warfare. What does the Battle of Mactan emphasize about Filipino warfare? What lessons can we draw from it? When, for example, we're looking at what's happening with China, for example.
That kind of is kind of an important and interesting kind of comparison to be drawn. And the that's why, like, kind of, I mean, it really delimits our kind of understanding of historical events or historical realities. If we look at history in terms of kind of a binary view, like
Right.
resistance and collaboration.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
kind of reducing it to
Yeah.
kind of we're thrust at this situation is much more complex than kind of, you know.
Yeah, it's not just, people are, fight like Lapu-Lapu.
Yeah,
Just fight, fight, fight. And Lapu-Lapu did not just fight, fight, fight. He was thinking how to win.
yes, yes. So, I think the problem with, like, kind of, I mean, like, for instance, this Lapu-Lapu is a symbol of Filipino
Defiance.
defiance
Yes.
against
Foreign aggression.
I mean, that's kind of a comic book kind of theme in the story. And one problem there is the tendency to kind of oversimplify what what the historical realities really are.
Yeah.
I mean, to cite an example and kind of uh, and this illustrates too why it's interesting to think it in terms of in the context of globalization. You recall that there was this controversy over the Lapulapu Monument in Luneta.
Yes, Sentinel of Freedom during the time of Senator Gordon. Yes.
Is it still there?
It is still there.
So kind of this was, I think, officially called like Sentinel of Freedom.
Yes.
And there you have an image of Lapu-Lapu with his
Kampilan watching,
planting on the ground, facing the sea. It's a kind of a guardian against the foreign intrusion.
Yes.
Intrusion. And there was kind of a controversy whether that was the right place for the monument. And the Lapu-Lapu city government was very quick in offering that it should be transferred to Mactan.
Right.
So that they would like to have that monument transferred to Mactan if kind of it's removed from Luneta, because the I based this just on the newspaper report that Lapu-Lapu city government planned to construct an artificial island off Ponta Engaño, where the monument will be placed, and it will be our version of the Statue of Liberty. A small artificial island off Ponta Engaño, Lapu-Lapu guarding Mactan against enemies coming from overseas. And I commented that kind of it's somewhat kind of sad, in a way sad and ironic, that you have Lapu-Lapu there standing against, as it were, kind of any foreign threats, guarding his island, and yet behind him, Mactan has almost been completely taken over by foreigners.
Yes.
I mean, like site of the U.S. Military base at the height of the Vietnam War, an export processing zone, an international airport, kind of hotels. I mean, you don't have a public beach anymore because they've all been privatized. So wouldn't it be kind of, in a sense, embarrassing to have Lapu-Lapu guarding his island
when they're all in?
In fact, his island has already been taken over. So kind of, if you frame it in terms of not in the kind of comic book terms of like a foreign invasion of the Philippines, but in terms of what the effects are of globalization, which kind of, in many respects kind of liberating, but in other respects too quite dangerous and debilitating for the Philippine economy.
Yeah, but it's good that you've emphasized in your lecture that Magellan was actually interfering in the social system, in which my take was he's still a hero in a way, even if he's going to submit to the King of Spain, because he was giving this setup that would make someone king of kings, like in Europe, and Lapu-Lapu did not want it. So in many ways, I always justify that he's still an inspiration, a hero,
Yes, yes.
because he did not want foreigners interfering our social system.
Yes, yes.
Because people do not realize that it's about the interference of the social system which will alter the life of the Filipinos, which Lapu-Lapu was able to prevent at least for the next 43 years.
Yes.
So that makes Lapu-Lapu still a great person. No?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Now, I would like to, I also love the lecture that you gave now because you talked about Cebu as an entrepot. A lot of people miss this, miss the dynamics of the battle and why Humabon befriended Magellan in saying that Cebu, in not recognizing that Cebu was actually an entrepot of trade in Southeast Asia. I think in Bisaya they call it Tauban. It's a Tauban. So this there are so many things that Filipinos can actually learn from the 1521 story that tells us that we Filipinos, in many ways, this is of course the idealized side of me, because I am both pragmatic and sometimes I need to, as a teacher, simplify, tell people of ideals and say, you can learn something from our ancestors. The Quincentennial commemoration is not really just about the arrival of colonization, or because it did not yet arrive because of Lapu-Lapu, but really it's a celebration of our ancestors and their culture, which we should emphasize. Now, the question is, you talked about simplifying things. Of course, the problem is, we social scientists in the collegiate level, when we teach, we do not realize that sometimes it's very hard for teachers to teach the way we teach. So I guess my question is, do you have suggestions on how teachers can teach these things, because it's important. 1521 is important in giving us a lens about our history, about ourselves. But because there are a lot of people are watching us regularly in the Quincentennial Lecture Series who are teachers, what can you tell them about oversimplifying history, and maybe give some advice about how to teach these things to kids, or to at least in the general public? Quite a hard question.
Yes.
Mhm.
Now, the kind of, you can, like, of course, kind of just select kind of the lessons that are key and
Right.
important.
Mhm.
Like the point about pre-Spanish polity as being considered of chiefdoms.
Right.
I mean, that's an important kind of lesson, important lesson to learn. No? So, and the because kind of there's still a great deal about like pre-Spanish history and culture that we're
Right.
not really, we don't really know. We're not familiar with. So the matter of like how in certain ways Cebu was already plugged into kind of into other countries even
Right.
before.
Yes.
So I think what makes 1521 the 16th century an important century is that historians see developments in local society which indicate that we were kind of on the kind of verge of kind of really kind of lift off in the economy.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
with the expansion of trade and kind of the emergence of native industries. So the I think an important lesson that one can impart would have something to do with what kind of these developments were, and how kind of the intrusion of European colonialism, in a sense, changed in certain ways the trajectory of this kind of this development. You know?
Right, right.
So
That's good. That again, to emphasize that we had a system before that is already connected with our Southeast Asian neighbors, and that we're actually Austronesians. That's the base culture of the Filipinos, and that despite the fact that yes, we are a multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilingual people, we are connected by this culture, and I think that's the lesson of 1521. Now, I think it's important to point out that some people had suggested, like my mentor, Seyu Salazar, in many ways criticizes the commemoration of 1521 because it was not a watershed event. That we should remember more what happened after Legazpi came, because that really changed our lives as a people. But and that is a valid point. I actually believe him. But I think the reason why 1521 has a clear what they call this recall to Filipinos, even today, is one, because of our heroes themselves. Number two, because of the books, history textbooks before the indigenization movement, Pantayong Pananaw and all of that. But also because of Yoyoy Villame. Cebu's Yoyoy Villame, who popularized this on March 16, 1521, when Philippines was discovered by Magellan. Now, of course, you're always asked this. How do you react to people who still believe that Magellan discovered the Philippines?
Yeah, that's why you kind of always qualify it as the European discovery of the Philippines.
In their perspective, it's valid.
European discovery of the Philippines, yes. So after what does kind of discovery mean?
Right.
Yeah. Kind of in fact, the interesting question, I mean, there's an interesting discussion with respect to Magellan's coming to the Philippines, about how Magellan, in fact, was already in the Philippines like 10 years earlier.
Right.
When he was fighting as a Portuguese, fighting for the Portuguese king in Malacca and in India. And that's why kind of I tend to believe that kind of, I don't know what the current state of scholarship on that subject is, but I find the kind of that theory very persuasive, that in fact Magellan had already kind of at least costed the archipelago in 1510, 1511.
Antonio Molina already wrote it in the Philippines in his book.
So that in effect, when he came to the Philippines, he had already circumnavigated the globe.
Yes.
He was here in around 15,
quite close.
1511. Yeah. So like the question of like who's the more deserving as the circumnavigator, I think it's clearly Magellan. It's clearly Magellan who deserves the credit of being the circumnavigator.
Aside from the fact that he dared to cross.
Yes. So so that's and that in fact that's because that's the only explanation, as I said, why Magellan stayed in Cebu for so long.
Right.
And why he started baptizing the natives and rearranging the political system. Because before he left Spain, there was already a secret agreement between the Spanish king and Magellan that whatever lands he would discover, as it were, and by that is meant land that the Portuguese had not yet claimed. And he would claim, and he would be rewarded by being kind of, in a sense, the adelantado of the new land. In fact, a share of the revenues from the land, and so on. So I think he had in his mind, like when he came to Cebu, that this was going to be land that he would own, claim for Spain. Claim for Spain.
You know, because there's and before I end this, because we're supposed to end at 2:30. There's discourse now that says that Magellan's arrival in the Philippines was not about colonization, and I don't think so, because it was explicit that when the Pope
Mm.
and the Treaty of Tordesillas divided the world, that was about colonialism. And that any land they land on, they can claim it, and the riches of that they can divide with the King of Spain. And I think that's why it's very important that you said this, because what I'm now telling people is that, yes, 1521 may not be the time when we were colonized, but definitely it placed us in the map.
Mm.
It made us vulnerable to colonization, and they came back. They really came back.
It's a kind of a similar question, and something that I was asked last week when we were talking about the baptism is, if, by all accounts, the baptism was not, in a sense, it was the baptisms of 1521 were not really real baptisms. Why should we date the beginning of Christianization in 1521 instead of
1565? Yeah.
When the
Christianization,
evangelization really kind of started in earnest. The Magellan expedition, the purpose of the expedition had nothing to do with spreading the Christian faith. That's why it was strange that they started baptizing Cebuanos. And the only explanation is that was part of the kind of, because the problem with baptism at the time is that it was a double act. It was not only a religious, but it was an act of political vassalage. So that kind of, in a sense, Magellan was already laying the groundwork for claiming the archipelago as Spanish territory. But if you a lot of of course, the church historians are because of the kind of idea of providential history, would still tend to kind of, I think, adopt the 1521 beginning. And in a way, kind of the key with respect to why 1521 was important is really the Santo Niño.
Oh yes,
because
that's true.
That's the one that linked 1521 to
1565. Yes.
Without the Santo Niño, there would be no link.
There would be no link.
Because kind of, so in fact, Miguel Lopez de Legazpi, in an interesting document, he wrote to the Spanish king reporting the finding of the Santo Niño image.
Right.
And he said, and his words were, he said, to the effect that it affirms the rightness of our mission.
Oh wow!
That God waited for us here.
Yeah. Wow.
God waited for us here, because the discovery of the Santo Niño image was considered by the Augustinians, the first missionaries, as the foundation of this Augustinian mission of the Philippines. So that kind of, in a sense, underscores the importance of because without that as a symbol, there would be nothing to link 1565 to 1521.
That's true. That's true. That's why I guess it is important to note here. And by the way, I was waiting for your questions, but nobody was asking. They're all just happy to listen to you, and they were greeting and all of that. And I guess Jerwil, one of our secretariat in the NQC, was right that nobody wants to argue with the national artist. But anyway, my last question would be, and I think this is important because we're in Cebu, ground zero of the Quincentennial commemorations in the Philippines. And of course, when we talk about the intellectual history, you are, of course, synonymous to the province. And well, again, I'm just so honored to talk to you and discuss about these things very openly. But I would like to ask you, and my last question would be, the events of 1521, what does it tell about Cebuanos? And does it continue to be relevant to Cebuanos?
Yes, kind of if you think of the events of 1521, in particular, kind of the Battle of Mactan, I think it has a special relevance to Cebuanos in the sense that kind of Cebu is very much kind of talking about like in the context of globalization. I mean, Cebu is in a sense at the forefront, you know,
Of that,
kind
of that early globalization.
of that process.
Yes.
But historically, as well as in many ways, even today, you know, I mean, I recall that kind of, for instance, during the martial law period, when the image of the Philippines was battered internationally because of the dictatorship. I mean, Cebu tried to like kind of detach itself from the nation and advertised Cebu as a island in the Pacific without reference to the Philippines whatsoever as a destination. And then post 1986, in fact, there was even talk of like kind of the ambitions, kind of the period of the Cebu boom, like kind of developing Cebu as kind of the next Singapore, you know,
Right,
kind
right,
of,
right. Yeah.
and so on. So so Cebu is very much kind of, you know, it's interesting that Sugbo, the word Sugbo,
Sugbo, yeah.
which is the local name
Local term.
for Cebu. Sugbo etymologically means to wade in the water.
Oh, to wade in
Because
water.
before the shoreline of Cebu is so shallow that incoming boats, you have to get out of the boat and
Yes.
wade in the water to get to dry.
I noted that even coming from the airport. It's very shallow.
To get to dry land. That means Sugbo is to wade in the water to get to dry ground. So I was saying that many of kind of keywords in Cebuano have to do with kind of, which is, I think, something that defines Cebu's character, that it's open to the world. It's a place where people arrive and depart. People coming and going. So that I think the name Cebu is perfect, because Cebu, after all, like kind of traditional, a city of merchants. You know, it's not kind of agricultural like Negros, for instance. It's really a trading. It's really historically a trading center, meaning it's kind of plugged into the outside world and kind of in the sense, the drama that took place in Mactan in 1521 is a drama that continues up to
this day. Wow.
Today.
Yeah.
And of course, the challenge for Cebuanos today is how do we position ourselves in relation to all these things that are coming in from the outside and so on. So that's, I would say, is kind of the larger significance of the celebration.
Fantastic. It makes us reflect, sir.
So this is not kind of if Andres Bonifacio is the kind of the quintessential hero of nationalism.
Right.
Kind of Lapulapu is more meaningful in a different context.
Wow. Wow. And again, it underscores the importance of Cebu also to our national history. That's why Cebu itself, the history of Cebu, is a legacy to our country. Yeah. Wow. Wow. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Now, before we end our broadcast, and again, I thank all those who commented, all those who watched. We're sorry we're not able to read all your shout outs, but thank you so much for watching. Before we let you go, I would like to present you from the National Quincentennial Committee. I will not let you hold it. I will sanitize it first because I am holding it. But this is the Lapulapu statue monument. It's a gift from the National Quincentennial Committee. Yeah? Wow. Yeah, thank you, sir. And again, we would like to thank all our all the people who are behind this webinar, the Quincentennial Lecture Series number 7. One of the great events here in the Ground Zero Quincentennial commemorations in the Philippines. Lapulapu and Mactan, Heritage of the Filipino by our National Artist Resil Mojares. This was brought to you by the National Quincentennial Committee, Presidential Communications Operations Office, National Historical Commission of the Philippines, Radio TV Malacanang, Philippine Information Agency, the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Department of Education, National Commission for Culture and the Arts, Cebu City Government of Cebu, Cebu City Historical and Cultural Affairs Office, and Cebu Studies Center, which you founded, sir. Yeah, wow. Thank you so much. So again, I guess the only thing to say here is, thank God we have this commemoration of our history today, 2021. Because commemorations, they bring up our interest in history. To look back, to reflect on how our history affected us today and what it teaches us about ourselves. The Quincentennial commemoration in the Philippines is not about colonization. This celebration is about us. It's about ourselves. The things that we have shown, victory, but before victory, there should be humanity. And I guess that tells us a lot about our history, about ourselves. So, sir, again, thank you so much. I am Xiao Chua, a public historian for the National Quincentennial Committee. Thank you so much. Maligayang Quincentenaryo sa ating lahat. Mabuhi.